everyone. Welcome to our second weekly office hours. I'm here with Dr. Arturo Hernandez on my green. So shall we just get started, dive right in?
Yes.
All right, so this week we had some very interesting questions, mostly regarding AOA, which was the topic of the chapter, so that's not too surprising. So the first question has to do with pronunciation. So you suggest in the lectures that pronunciation is one of those things that's better acquired when a child is younger. So does that suggest that children should have basically perfect accents?
That's a really good question. I think in the course we'll cover a little bit about phonology and second language acquisition, or bilingual, simultaneous, whichever manner of acquisition there is. But I think we have to be mindful of the fact that children have their pronunciation changes as they go from across childhood to teenage to adulthood. So it's not that child's speech sounds just like adult speech. There are changes in pronunciation, even for someone who speaks just one language. So I think that's the first thing we have to be mindful of, is that kids will not speak exactly like adults, even if they're monolingual. And we know that some sounds in a language are harder to and take longer to acquire than others. So like the trilled R and the R in Spanish, it takes monolingual Spanish children a while to learn that sound. So sounds have their own developmental path, and so we should be careful or a parent should be careful not to worry too much about a child who doesn't sound like an adult yet, because the vast majority of children do not sound like adults. So that's the answer to the first question. And then there was a sort of
Right. We had a follow-up question. Is it possible for children to have no accent in one language, but have an accent in their second language, even if they're growing up bilingual?
That, again, there is not a lot of data, but there is some data that suggests that even when you have simultaneous bilingualism with lots of exposures, work done by Nuria Sebastián Galles and her colleagues, research team in Catalonia, and so in Barcelona, they found that in fact when you look at simultaneous bilinguals who seem to have exposure to both languages, initially I think the research indicated there might be an accent from whatever their home language or most used language or their base language, and it gets difficult to establish that in such a bilingual kind of environment such as Barcelona. But newer work suggests that in fact there may be some differences in how well the phonology of a language can be picked up by individuals, such that some individuals seem to have less of an accent in both languages. Some individuals have accents in both languages. Some individuals seem to be more based in the phonology of one language versus the other. Of course, in the case of Catalan and Spanish, there are these very subtle vowel differences that exist. So they're not huge differences, but they're there. And again, it is possible that you could see an accent in one language and not the other. In both languages, in neither language, all those different patterns of development would be possible and not in any way indicate any sort of delay.
Right. And do you think that maybe the ability to pick up on accents in different languages has to do with musical ability as well?
It could be. I mean, there is some data linking the ability to pick up rhythm and musical sort of timing with the development of grammar. This is a newer paper that just came out this year. By a group at Vanderbilt University that's looked at this type of processing. So there does seem to be a connection between those two. Again, it's not something that's really been looked at in the realm of bilingualism. It's been looked at the realm of language and music. And there's not a huge literature on it. It's sort of growing.
So definitely an exciting field to get into right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah. And so the last question that kind of arises from this discussion is actually my question. I figured I would piggyback on this and ask you whether a child's accent in, let's say, a second language could be influenced by a parent or a caregiver's accent in that language.
So yes, I mean, I think that there is an influence. Of course, we have to ask, what's the environmental language of the child? So to what extent has a child been exposed to a language and they hear a native-like accent, then they'll pick that up, that environmental accent up. Now, of course, what happens to children who have a child who has parents who speak a non-native accent, or even a different regional accent within the same language, is that the child will be able to imitate that accent quite well. And in fact, many times in a multicultural place like Houston, in a multilingual place like Houston, what ends up happening is the kids end up imitating their parents' language. So they'll speak English with different accented versions of English, and they'll play around with each other. And then the kids will imitate their parents' accent, right? And so it becomes very funny and comical. And then, of course, other kids start imitating other, versions of accented English. And so it becomes this big game where all the different kids are, imitating their own parents' accent or their own sort of native accent of their parents or somebody else's parents' native accent. And it becomes kind of this game of let's see how many different types of accents we can imitate, as a comical kind of fun kind of thing. So yes, they can imitate it, but that doesn't mean they'll have it. It may actually mean they're just going to make fun of their parents because they don't speak the way everybody else does. Well, the way everybody else does in a standard sort of dialect
right.
or a standard accent.
Right, and the reason that I asked that question is because when my family and I just moved to the United States, my sister, she was like 3 or 4, and she went to this preschool, and that was her only input for English. And the teacher at the preschool had a very thick Russian accent, and so she started speaking English with a Russian accent, and it was so funny because no one else around her spoke with a Russian accent, so she just had this heavy Russian accent in English that she picked up from preschool, so that was just really funny for us.
And I guess the question is, does she still have it today?
Oh, no. She has the standard California accent.
Okay, so that sort of shows you, right, what children are trying to do is imitate the environment around them. And so they're really good imitators. I mean, one of the classical stories I talk about this in the book is the case of Nemchimsky, where his family took in a chimp to raise this chimp to be just like a human, and in the end the child actually acted more like the chimp than the chimp like the child. So, I mean, that's an extreme example, but it's same with the Russian accent, right? Yes, so she could imitate this accent, and probably today, if you asked her to imitate that accent, she might be able to do it pretty well. But that doesn't mean she's going to speak that way. So there's a lot of imitation and playing with sound that's going on with kids. So, I mean, those are just natural types of things that happen, and obviously today she doesn't speak with a Russian accent, right. So, and she may be able to imitate it, but she knows that that's not the way she normally speaks.
Right. So let's move on to our next question. This one has to do with Helen Keller and age of acquisition. So she was deaf, blind, and mute, and yet later on in life she was able to become proficient in a form of sign language, and she got a BA, and she was a writer. How does that relate to age of acquisition and what we learned about Jeanne and Victor?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting case, and I think we have to be mindful of the big differences between these. So, I mean, Helen Keller was not a feral child. She didn't grow up without a family. She was obviously got sick around 19 months of age. So by that time, she already had language, most likely words. I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating, but I'm guessing that she was good at language. She had good capability to learn it. I'm not saying that, again, we all humans have the capability, but some people seem to be more able to learn it and sort of swim and live in language, and others less so. So she was very capable, and she had exposure. And in fact, she developed her own home sign because one of the people that worked in her household, one of the children of the people that worked in her household, actually could communicate with her. So even though obviously her sensory experience changed because she no longer had full access to all her senses, she basically funneled it all through the senses she had available and continued communicating, developing her language over time. And I think what it shows is the incredible adaptability of our cognitive system and sensory system to find a way to solve a problem that is on the surface impossible to solve. How do you communicate without all of the different modalities that you would need to communicate? And she found a way, which is, incredible in and of itself. But I think we're talking about an alteration, but not deprivation.
Right. So it's not that she had a late AOA. She developed language in just a completely different route than most kids would take. But she still had that early AOA.
Yes, and she would have had symbolic representation. She would have known that a word stood for something in the world. So with that, she was able to take that and then co-opt it and basically forge her own path towards language proficiency, which I think again shows you the adaptability of our cognitive system.
Right, and of course, cases like Jeanne and Victor, they're severe abuse that they went through as children, whereas Helen Keller grew up in a very supportive environment, right? So, of course, that must have some kind
Well, I
of
mean, for
influence.
Jeanne, it's clear it was abuse. For Victor, I think the story is that he grew up with wolves. So, I mean, I think they protected him and took care of him. I mean, because they didn't eat him, right? So he became part of the wolf pack in some way, but it wasn't normal or typical human interaction, right? And so that was a problem. He could never blend in with human society. With Jeanne, it was abusive.
So what I love about these stories is, well, of course, they're terrible stories, but I think it's very interesting how the social development goes along with language development, how closely tied they are to one another.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, ultimately, I mean, there are groups of people who want to learn language just as an object. These are hyper-polyglots who speak 11 or more languages, so language becomes an object for them that they study. But for most of us that aren't hyper-polyglots, which is the vast majority of humans, they speak less than 11 languages. It's a purpose that language serves, that is to communicate. And so that's social.
Right. So speaking of gaining proficiency in the language, this kind of brings us into our last discussion question that I wanted to bring up with you. There's a poster that notes that she teaches English to adults, and she noticed that the older adults, like 30 years plus, actually do better than some of her young adults, so 18 years to 21. And what she thinks is that has to do with the first language that they know and how closely that relates to English. So, for example, Spanish or Italian speakers might have an easier time learning English than someone who speaks Vietnamese. What do you think about the relationship between first and second language?
I mean, I think I'll take an Anglo-centric point of view because that's the data that I know of, which is basically if you look in the United States Defense Language Institute. So they've set up essentially a chart of languages that English speakers can learn. And how long it should take for them to learn them. And of course, at the bottom of that, in terms of the easiest ones, are Romance languages. So those take about 4 months to learn. Of course, intensive training to pick up, proficiency in that. We're not talking about native-like proficiency, just to be able to communicate, effectively. If we then go to the next layer, it's things like German, another layer, Hebrew, Polish, Russian, and then the final, really hardest layer, Hungarian is also in that other layer. The hardest one is Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and Arabic. So these are 2 years. So again, if you're coming in the other direction, from an Asian language to English, it's a much harder path to trail or to go up, right, than it is for someone coming from a Romance language. And so, again, yes, the distance between the languages plays a role, although, ironically, the distance sort of sets how quickly you progress initially. So if you're going from a language that's very similar, your progress can seem quite miraculous and quite high quickly. But then the problem is if the languages are very similar, then it gets very difficult to deal with those subtle differences. And so you get the effect of portuñol, if you want to talk about Portuguese and Spanish, or Spanglish, if you want to talk English and Spanish, another example, right? So in terms of languages that are similar, again, it's going to be difficult to get all the way there because there'll be these very subtle differences that a speaker has to be mindful of. But they'll be able to make a lot of progress quickly. If they're typologically different, then you're going to have a lot of hard work to do just to get into the language. And that's just going to take a lot of time. So yes, typology matters.
So that's very interesting. It seems like if you want to become proficient in a language, then it would be easier if your first language is more related to it. But once you do speak it, then if the languages are very related, you might confuse them more than if they were very unrelated.
Well, it's not that you'll confuse them more because there's a lot of overlap. So it's just that you'll confuse them in very specific places. So they'll be very noticeable. And I mean, one story that somebody told me one time that was Dutch was that during World War II, the way they figured out whether someone was German or not is they would just make them speak. Right, and so when they crossed the border, they knew immediately who the German spies were by just having them try to speak. Now notice, Holland and Germany are very close to each other, and so you know, typologically, those languages are quite similar. I mean, when I went from Germany to Holland, I just kept thinking like, okay, this is somewhere between. I could almost see like how German and English relate because it was like somewhere in between. You know, it's like as you progress, you just see this sort of changing of the language from, you know, German to Dutch to English. And so typologically they're very similar, but to really be native-like, right, in this case, you know, it was pronunciation, but to really be native-like is difficult because those differences are quite subtle. So, you know, it depends on how you want to think about it. The fact that you can get in is great. I mean, and so you should be happy about being able to get in. Now, if you want to be like, you know, fully in, like up to, you know, really be able to proficiently use it, then yes, there will be those little subtle places where you have to work at distinguishing very subtle distinctions.
Well, I think we're all out of time for today for our office hour meeting. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thank
and
you
thank you
for
for watching and for participating in the forums. We'll do this again next week. Please do continue to post your discussions and questions in the forum, and we'll see you next week.